Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and right next to me is my lovely co-host, the Chattering Teacup.
Hello.
And here with us from North Carolina, from across the pond, Robert Creekmore. Hello, Robert, and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Well, hello there. Good to be here.
It's lovely to have you on our show, and we are here to discuss the first two books of your trilogy, Prophet's Death and Prophet's Lamentation. And we also may dive a little bit in the short one, Dar River Boys, if we may.
Yeah, sure. But it's up to you. Whatever you want to talk about first, I'm down.
Wonderful. So, Robert, we've read the books, and I told you before we started the recording, I couldn't put down the first one. I read it in one day. The second one took me slightly longer because, like I said, real life gets in the way, job gets in the way. But it was a fascinating journey of your main character, Naomi, and everything that happened to her. And like I said before also, it was frighteningly realistic. And what can you tell our listeners about this trilogy? Where did the idea for this trilogy come from?
Well, I've had a very sordid past with the church. So there are things that, I won't discuss that were disturbing that have happened to me in the church. And as I kind of blocked those things out, and as I grew older, some of those things started coming back. And there was a couple of times in my life I ended up in psychiatric hospital. Well, after I got out of the psychiatric hospital the second time, yeah, I know, right? I was told to journal, and I'd already written a book before, the Fear Eye book, and which, you know, is science fiction. It's just very, very different in a way. And so I was like, you know what? It's too personal. I want to write something that's an allegory. And, you know, it began as kind of an allegory about all those experiences and turned into something completely different. I incorporated I spent several years in this cabin that was built in the 1800s on the side of a mountain, living in, you know, almost self-sustaining in a very remote place in the Appalachians. And so I kind of took from that, and took from some of the characters that I've met. And I mean that literally they were characters in real life, and started integrating that into this piece. Now the piece isn't the piece that you'll read today. The way I wrote it, I started kind of in the middle with Naomi telling the story to Vernon after she captures Vernon, who's the prophet. And I never submitted it really to a publisher. I was on Twitter on my last Twitter account. I lost my last Twitter account to the purge after Elon came on, which is lovely. I told Elon that the Matrix was a trans allegory and didn't belong to him. Anyway, I lost my account the next morning. So there was this post on Twitter, and a writer from the publishing house that I'm on now said something along the lines about not liking stories where there's no redemption, even though there's revenge, like that the person getting revenge didn't learn a lesson, right? Oh, revenge is wrong or whatever. And I commented, the moral of my book that I wrote should be called Some Motherfuckers Need Killing. So the publisher emailed me and was like, you know what? I want to read that. I was like, okay, here you go. Have a read. And they came back and were like, if you rewrite it this way, then you have a publishing deal. So I rewrote the entire book in 6 months. And after rewriting it, they were like, can you make this a trilogy? And I was like, sure, I can. Can I make this a trilogy? I mean, like, I wouldn't call it lying, but embellishment of my own, capacity, like what my own, perceived capacity. And maybe there's a lot of self-doubt there. But so I wrote another book last year. So it was Prophet's Lamentation, which is a continuation of the story. And I laid some stuff in the first book purposefully or a sequel, and to kind of get into the mythology that I get into later in the second book, because the mythology I use is kind of unique. It's not, you know, like established type of mythology. I tried to come up with something my own, and they liked it. And after reading the second book, they were like, can we give you a fourth book contract? So it's actually not just a trilogy anymore. It's a trilogy with a separate book that I've already written part of called Diary of Attrition, which follows Tiffany's story, who is Naomi's girlfriend, whom she's ripped apart from when they are 14. So that follows her for 11 years, the 11 years where they're separated in the first book. And so I guess I won't hide that there's mythology, there's fantasy that's not just rooted in reality, which I find that people like that because so many of us, most of us don't have any power in the world. Like that's why we're so attracted to stories about people who have abilities that are supernatural and things of that nature because we have no power. And seeing a fictional character who has some power, who's from the common people, is always appealing to us. But Tiffany's story, there will be it's going to be more literary fiction. I've already written probably the first 20,000 words of that. I wrote that last year while I was finishing up the edit of Prophet's Lamentation, which, comes out this July 4th for some reason, which is Americans, Independence Day or whatever. Or not whatever. That's definitely what it is. It's the week where my dog hides under my desk because people set off munitions in celebration for sometimes well on into September because they buy too many and then just a hobby at this point.
And then they probably start again for New Year's.
That's correct. That's correct.
Well,
but it's less, but yes, very much so. Fireworks are a big thing in America. I don't know. I'm sure they are in other parts of the world. So
yeah. Unfortunately, yes.
Yes. I mean, I get it. 2 days of the year, maybe. July 4th, New Year's. Hey, cool. Stop after that.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, the story you said it's supernatural, and the parts in your book, I do understand it. But like I said before, I mean, the part that takes place in the real world, that's the frightening part.
It's very realistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And because of what we heard and saw in news, and it seems real, not fictional.
Yeah.
I'm from that world, and I'm a bit of an apostate. I'm my father and my grandfather are neo-Confederates. Like I'm named for Robert E. Lee. Like my middle name is grammatically incorrect. It's E-L-E-E. I don't know why. But I grew up deep in that world. I grew up deep in neo-Confederacy and that kind of ideology that was it goes hand in hand with like the Christian identity movement, which is also kind of where people like McVeigh, who's the Oklahoma City bomber, took to a further extreme. And in a lot of ways, the story arc of this trilogy starts in 93 and it'll go to about 2019. Kind of mirrors the attempted rise of the white nationalist movement in the United States that began in the 1990s as the militia movement, when people started calling themselves patriots instead of, neo-Nazis or whatever. And shows that progression and how that became a political movement that we still see today, but hopefully is fading away. I hope.
May I ask, why did it start at this point in time? What was the reason, or was there a certain event that was the Kickstarter for this change or this movement to take off like that?
Well, that's the year I'm the same age as the main character. So that's the year I ended up in Christian school. And I believe it's also the year that Waco occurred, which was one of the biggest catalysts for that movement to take off. I think it is. I can't recall exactly, but primarily it's because I was an age where I ended up in that environment. And I had been in that environment to some degree, but not to the extreme that I had found myself at that time, where I had people in class reading the Turner Diaries. If you don't know what the Turner Diaries are, they're very influential. It's a very influential book that was written in the 1970s about a race war that was set off by bombing a federal building. And so, those are the kind of things that were around me in that situation. I mean, that's the thing that McVeigh used to justify and plan the bombing in Oklahoma City in 1995. And that's why I use that time period as the genesis. And I follow it through. I mean, I'm not going to hide my politics through the Trump years, which I think is a form of proto-fascist nationalism. It's slightly confusing because it's not exactly race-based, but it is and it isn't, because fascism doesn't have to be about racism.
Yep.
It has to be about, to some degree, do what I say, and the truth lies in one person. You look to that person, and our country is always best. Everything we do is right. You better not question it, or bad things will happen to you. Which is what it could be to some degree momentarily, not completely, but fascism's like a smoldering fire. It never goes out. It smolders, in the underbrush of the forest. Occasionally got to stop on it when it flares up. And, that's what we're trying to do here. And I don't mean that in the literal physical, like we're going to hurt people, but you have to push it back with ideas that are logical and caring, that are enlightening, and hope to appeal to the city of people who may be amenable to the ideas that the other side is putting out there and show them you should really just have empathy and sympathy for, other humans. And if you can just push that small portion of the population into a level of questioning and maybe sympathy, then you can stomp that out. And then a few years later, you're going to have to do it again, and so on and so forth. And to perpetuity, I'm assuming 100 years from now, we'll still be dealing with those kind of ultra right-wing nationalistic ideas and tendencies.
And you said before, I mean, the Baptist movement, or it's also in the book of the First Baptist Church. I mean, how large of a movement is it?
Huge. It's 30% of the American population. It's huge. We're talking about a church that supported Jim Crow, a church with leaders, and you can go look up Bob Jones. There is a big university in South Carolina called Bob Jones University. In fact, I mentioned it in my book. There was a large proponent of Jim Crow and segregation. And there were actual sermons about segregation, or being for segregation, being against desegregation. And you can hear them today. And those are from the 1960s, which is not that long ago, in the grand scheme of things, even though it might seem that way to younger people. They didn't apologize. The Southern Baptist Convention did not apologize for their support of Jim Crow and segregation until 1995. Seinfeld was on TV in 1995. In fact, Bob Jones University not allow interracial dating until 2002.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know if you've been to the States, but it is a peculiar place.
Yeah, you have been to the States, but just New York for a very short time.
Yeah, for once.
Yeah. But it's not a monolith. Their regions are different, but, my neighbor is different than I am, and so on and so forth. And, we're all going to disagree to some degree, and I think that's healthy. But certain regions of the country are more prone to that lack of being able to compromise. I live in one, but it's not the harshest version of that. There are far harsher places than North Carolina, at least today. Actually, I just got back from New York, and that was my first time in New York. And I got back Tuesday, and it's Saturday. Very different. I've never been to New York City before. And I was kind of shocked because most of my life in the South, I've been told how people from New York are. They were so nice. I had such a good time.
Yeah. I mean, what I wanted to ask you about Naomi's story at the beginning, or how this all starts with her ending up with Vernon. I mean, it also seems very realistic when reading it, like you said, Dika, what we've seen or read or heard about communities like that. Those very religious, those very evangelical people who, preach fire and brimstone and so on. And I mean, it also seems very plausible that things like that do happen more often than not, still.
Oh, very much so. Even though we've outlawed that kind of so-called conversion therapy. A lot of us now call it pray to get away camps. In fact, there have been documentaries about it. All these institutions. Exodus International is one of the ones I kind of looked at when I was thinking about it, but it's definitely not the model for it. There are plenty of documented cases of people being sent to places like this, tortured, forced into relationships with people that they would not want to be in relationships with, forced into marriages, raped as corrective rape, mutilated, things of that nature. Many of the things that happen in my book, which is part of the reason that the first quarter of the book, there's no supernatural inclinations whatsoever. And I think it's a bit of a surprise if you're not expecting it, 100 and some pages into the book. All of a sudden there's this mythological creature named Mara. And if you study the Bible, a lot of what I do is I use kind of biblical ideas. I definitely isn't a one-to-one, but that was Ruth's mother. And she became upset with God, and her name was Naomi. And then she said, I'm bitter. Now you call me Mara.
Yeah.
And that was her bitter name. And that's part of the reason I use that name as the mythological character, to show the bitterness but what the power that comes from that anger and bitterness, in the story. But like I said, I wanted to leave the first part completely free and the character completely powerless, and to show what really has happened and is really still happening in the United States, with the way that LGBTQ plus youth are treated. It is very much a reality, and I cannot overstate it. And so many people think that that's a thing of the past. It's not. It's not. You're just not seeing it because it's not televised or on TikTok. It's very much, very, very much happening in pocket of this place.
You just said Mara is rooted in the Old Testament, the idea of Ruth's mother-in-law, I think.
Correct.
And also the idea, I mean, it's a Jewish mythology, the golem, which is discussed when Naomi finds refuge.
Correct. And the idea of the golem is, and the Talmud is that God created Adam. Adam was just mud and dirt, but without having a spirit injected into him, he was never a man. So they call him golem. And the Jewish people have been able to, in mythology, not reality, create golem, but they are not God. So they can only create the physical aspect and have it do their bidding. The whole mythology in my book involves that golem also having a pseudo spirit, the light that's in there. And you read about that mythology in the second book, and it mirrors that to some degree. And in the books, God is definitely not the Christian God, and it's this entirely different mythology. And I wanted to give a demigod the ability to create. And what would it be like if a human became a demigod and was able to create and influence? Because, like I've said, those stories resonate because we have no power. We feel at the mercy of either a god or just chance.
Yeah.
Fiction's where we go for refuge.
But it could have been also gone in a different path, your story. What I mean is, we've discussed it, Teacup. You said people have no power, especially the average person doesn't have any power, certainly no superpower. But might have been also possible for Naomi to go a different path, and to make it also plausible, let's say law enforcement. I mean, it would have been harder to get her revenge, most certainly. But would have been also a possibility
to fight these people.
Yeah.
Well, there are too many constraints in law enforcement. One, two, I've never been a police officer, so I try to write what I know, which is for me important. because I don't want to come off as unauthentic. So what
Mm-hmm.
if I write her as a cop and she does something that would,
Mm-hmm.
it just procedurally would be
Yeah.
incorrect. And
Yeah.
that opens me up for criticism
Yeah.
of everything else. And, the police in this country are generally charged with enforcing the will of the upper class who has power. It's really not about enforcing the law equally.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not unique to the United States by any stretch.
Yeah.
So her being a cop would essentially be putting her in league with the people who are in charge or doing their bidding.
Mm-hmm.
When her being basically independent of that allows her to develop her own moral code and assess. I call it selective sociopath. Like she's a selective sociopath. She stopped feeling empathy and care for someone who does something completely horrible.
Mm-hmm.
Under the law, we're supposed to be objective, which we aren't if somebody is very wealthy.
Yeah.
So she cannot be objective about these people. And I personally have no sympathy for folks who do things like that. And I sick the character on them in fiction because in reality it doesn't work. But in fiction there's a bit of cathartic nature to it. And I wanted to do something different because the cop drama is really overdone. The cop who's trying to get the right thing done. And I enjoy those. Like True Detective was fantastic. But the cop trying to get the right thing done while dealing with the constraints of the law has been done a lot. So I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something survival based, like wilderness based, because that's my world. I grew up in the woods, or the forest or whatever you want to call it, hunting and fishing and learning how to take care of myself in those situations. And that's something I could bring that was unique to fiction.
I mean, it was absolutely plausible and believable. I mean, we don't have any knowledge about surviving in the woods, do we, Teacup? No, we don't have any knowledge about weapons as well. I mean, it is, of course, believable in Naomi's case because the way you tell about her background, we always get glimpses of her past with her parents, her father, who was also, I think, a survivalist, and he taught her a lot of things, how to survive in the wild. I mean, we bought toilet paper when the pandemic hit. That's what we did in Austria. So that's what was our greatest worry.
That's what we did here too. That's what I hear too.
Yeah, exactly.
People want to make sure they're clean. I don't know.
I don't know either. Exactly. But I mean, I was with her. Like you said, I mean, this kind of revenge wouldn't have been possible if she were in law enforcement.
It would be a hindrance to be a police officer.
And I was absolutely with her with what she did and how she exacted her revenge. I have to admit that. I enjoyed it.
You will not be the first person who told me they enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I have had people who told me they enjoyed it, and one person who told me they vomited while reading.
No.
Yeah, it's the genital mutilation. But I understand that. I've had quite a few people tell me that that's the thing that really bothered them more than anything. You want to know the truth? There's a worse scene in there that my publisher made me cut.
Okay. I mean, which kind of, sorry, dear listeners, but which kind of mutilation? Hers? Sorry if I give hers, okay. But come to think of it, I mean, when you think what is happening to girls in other parts of the world, that's very common. And I mean, in her case, it was rather fortunate that they didn't use shards of glass or rusty knives or something like that, like they do in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I wanted to come up with something unique and something plausible. And what I used is, if you know what a dowel rod is basically like you can go to a hardware store and buy these round sticks that you would use for like chair backs if you wanted to have like different, like you wanted to make like you have an open back chair with little sticks basically in the chair, out of rods or whatever. But you can get them up to about 1.5 inches or 2 inches around. So her so this woman who's like a pseudo surgeon, pseudo medicine woman named Maddie Ballou, which is, by the way, a real Southern Appalachian last name, very common. They're the people that own my house. Like this is like they built the house that I lived in. That was their last name. They didn't do anything wrong. It's just a great, Appalachian name. In fact, the place where I live was gorgeous. The people were fantastic for the most part. Like it's complete fiction. So they drilled out a hole all the way down through this hole that's about 6 inches long and ran wire through it like a baling wire, twisted it and made it a circle and hooked it up to electricity, which made the wire glow hot red and could cauterize and scoop out flesh like a melon baller. And that's what she uses to scoop out Naomi's clitoris.
Yeah.
And the general mutilation that gets done. And I know there's in other parts of the world that, like you said, they use glass and things like that. But I thought that there's something uniquely American about creating an entire machine just to do it and to think about it in that complex of a way to engineer something to be efficient. Just like the way we came up with the electric chair, we thought, oh, well, this would be the most efficient way to murder people.
Yes.
And it wasn't. And that was that kind of American ingenuity to do harm that I wanted to put on display. Of course, we use that for good too, a lot of times. But yeah, that's why I used it. I think they thought, oh, well, it's fast. But of course, she talks about accidentally cauterizing someone's urethra and then they die.
Yeah, well.
Yeah.
Might a machine be used to distance oneself from what people are doing in this regard? Because if you actually take a knife and do it, you're a bit more nearer to what you're doing.
Yeah, I can see that. And I really never gave that thought. It's kind of like using a gun for distance if you murder someone with a pistol from 12 feet away.
Then gutting them.
Versus stabbing them in the chest. That's a very different type of crime. And I think you're right, because I think she wanted to have some kind of clinical distance. And it's a slight physical distance, but using something she feels is a clinical tool and it's something that's quick, it would be excruciatingly painful. Somehow makes it more acceptable, but no less monstrous in reality. So I agree with you, Teacup. I think that's true.
You can distance yourself from what you do easier than using a shard of glass or
even if it's 6 inches away. That's still distance. It's clinical distance.
Absolutely.
But she wanted to. But she's like she has trophies in a way that a serial killer would, and she keeps body parts like the clitoris in formaldehyde jars, and that comes into later being her destruction. But I won't go into how the formaldehyde.
No, of course we don't give too much away.
Destroyed her.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I mean, under different circumstances, do you think she would have been a serial killer?
Naomi?
No. Maddie.
I could see her as a poisoner. I think that would be more her style, because she is versed to some degree in chemicals and medicine. But given the permission that she had from the church, made it ever so convenient to do that without the risk or worry of reprisal for her actions, because she's completely protected. So it was more convenient to be a torturer than a murderer. And I think sometimes I think some serial killers are not well organized, and I think that's they have impulse control issues, and they just kill, and they don't think about it. But this is a woman who's intelligent, who thinks about the consequences and how can I circumvent those consequences through social structure. So she's a very intelligent person in that way.
You said before we started the recording, a certain type of people get drawn to certain kinds of cults. What would you say, in your estimation, your experience, what kind of personality does a person need to have to get caught or get drawn to this kind of cult you describe in your books? Not just in your prophet books, but also in your short story.
Someone who's unsure of who they are and needs definition of who they are to be a wider berth, to feel like they have to do something that affects the entire world and know that they are completely right and completely influencing the world and have some kind of secret knowledge. Like these are people a lot of times that don't know. So there aren't well-educated people. Not always. There's a lot of very well-educated Scientologists, but want to be in a position where they're something that other people don't know, and that their own self identities, like that they understand who they are less susceptible to becoming a part of a cult or even a part of a religion. If you want to parse out what the difference between those is, and that's a whole other show, I can't. I've heard the definition being that the person who established it is dead and other people continue on, and that's a religion. And if the person that established it is still alive, then it's a cult. I don't know. I think one of the hallmarks is they will put themselves over your family. You have to choose those close to you second, and the church or the cult first. And if you ever start seeing people dressing alike, then you really should get worried.
Yeah.
Is it, as you said before, we usually feel powerless, that people becoming members in such organizations feel some kind of power when they are in there because they know something or they are part of something bigger?
Yes, absolutely. And you can see that in the movement, in the MAGA movement in the U.S., where there's grievance. And if they gang up together, then they have power, which is true. They do. That's not, there was a time where there were newsletters that were faxed in the 90s where these guys started organizing. And I say guys because most of them are men. And a lot of that grievance is, rooted in that time. And then they start defining who they are by, and you see in the U.S. people whose entire entire personalities are based around guns. They pose with them on social media like they're their children, or their politics. And so their personality is how much they love Donald Trump, which is their enigmatic leader who's always right. And I know America is obsessed with Donald Trump. We have a good reason to be obsessed with Donald Trump. He's frightening and brilliant simultaneously, and stupid also at the same time. He's one of the dumbest smart people in the world. He's completely clueless in looking at his own actions, but at the same time is socially savvy beyond most people, beyond me for sure. And he knows what he's looking for, and he knows who to tell they're special. And of course, a lot of this plays out in the book. And I know I've strayed away from the book, but the influence of the time in which the book is written is extremely important. You look at like Orwell and his experience in the Spanish Civil War, and that plays into all his literature. And so, of course, I think if you live in a peaceful time, your literature might be, or our state time might be just a little less interesting in a lot of ways. If it could be flowery prose and things of that nature. But if you live in a time where there are people storming and attacking the capital of your country, there's a lot of good fodder for, to be analyzed and gone.
Robert, the question that comes to mind when you talk about the political situation now and also in your book, where are the people with common sense? Where are the decent people, the kind people?
They're afraid. They're afraid to speak up. And we see this time and time again in those kind of situations throughout history. The common decent people think, this will pass. I'll keep my mouth shut and stay safe. And the Silmans in a way are kind of like that. They're the couple that saves Naomi after she escapes, and they are isolated and kept prisoner by the apostles. Well, I say the apostles, it would be Solid Rock at the time, by fear that they'll get in trouble if they speak up.
Yeah.
If you leave, then you'll be in trouble because we have this and this we'll blame you for. In the book, I don't want to give away too much, but basically they have set it up so they could frame them if they leave.
Yeah.
They can frame them if they speak out, of something horrible. So that's part of it. It's the fear keeps people in line, and the thought, well, those people are not like me. I hate it for them, but I want to keep my family safe. And so if I just shut up, it'll pass. It's like a rainstorm, but sometimes those don't pass. Sometimes you have to say something, and the more people who say something, the more power the dissent has. It's the more people who are dissenting, the more people are convinced that maybe they're wrong, and the people in defense will come to their side, or the more power they seem to have, and the more they get listened to. Whereas if it's just one or two people, they can say, oh, well, look, they're lunatics, they don't love, the country the way you love the country because they criticize something, when all they really want to do is make it better, because they actually do love you should love the people, not the institution. And they're, showing empathy for the people, even, then that's, scary to those in charge, but it's easy to keep people from speaking out with fear.
Yeah, true.
So that's where they are.
And you said that the story is set in the 90s and also very, very influenced by what happened in the 90s. But
Correct.
quite at the beginning of the book, when reading it, I somehow had the feeling the relationship between, let's say, the pastor and his wife, it seemed more like in the 50s or 60s, not in the 90s, the way they interacted with each other.
Well, that is the way things were here in the 1990s. When I was in private religious school, we weren't allowed to listen to rock and roll music. We would get in trouble for rock and roll music. Now, it's even worse than that. There's this thing called contemporary Christian rock. It's
I've heard about it. Yeah.
Really bland version of facsimile of rock and roll. It's not really rock and roll because rock and roll is about rebellion. They were like, and that's also sinful. So you couldn't even have rock and roll for Jesus. That's how extreme it was. We were taught out of these books that were written in the 50s about what the traditional nuclear family is supposed to look like, how women are supposed to obey their husbands, how the power dynamics go in a family. And those were very real and very much the way I have witnessed families at that time period behaving, with the authoritarian father and a mother who is a cowering, beat down shell of herself, and kids who are terrified and are forced into to be who they are expected to be, not who they are, which makes them miserable. And so it is very real, and it might seem foreign to someone who has not been in that, not experienced that region during that time. But what you have to also understand is, if you think my internet's slow now, which has messed up some of my audio and we've turned off the video here, there was no internet. There was no influence. And the fact the roads that lead to where I live were very slow, and you couldn't get away to an even bigger town for quite some time. So there's no influence. There's 3 channels on TV. You are living separate. You are not allowed to play with children who aren't your same color. You're not allowed to question a church. You live in this small, tiny world. That tiny world didn't change. When I was a kid, we had this store down the road from us. It's this country store, and it was cool because there's all the, we can get Coca-Cola in the glass bottles and stuff. And that was the way it was back then. But there were men in that store who were old men at the time who were alive in the 1800s, who were, born in the 1890s. These guys were 80 and 90 years old, and they're still around. Those guys, can you imagine the influence? And these were elders in the community that guys from that period of time had on our gestalt at that period, because those were the guys we would listen to. There were no thought influencers, no TikTok and YouTube where people were giving you different ideas. There were no books in the library hardly that had political dissenting ideas. There were just science books, which were the political dissent that I participated in.
Mm-hmm.
We did have PBS and Carl Sagan on PBS,
Mm-hmm.
which was in Cosmos,
Yeah.
because they were teaching us that the world was 6,000 years old and
Mm-hmm.
we better behave because the world's coming to an end any minute. It's a bizarre world, and it's a bizarre place to come from to be where I am today, because that world doesn't exist anymore, even where I live.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it seems so strange to people, like, oh, this is like the 1950s. The 1950s didn't end in the southern US for decades.
It seems, sorry to interrupt, it seems a bit as if this place is frozen in time.
And the internet is the thing that really shifted the dynamic in this area. And the highway system finally being improved. There were places in my state that didn't have electricity until the 1960s, in the western part of the state. So the internet and the highway system being improved changed everything here. So now you can get out to a larger town in like 45 minutes. In Raleigh, which is the state capital, has over 1 million people in it now, from all over. Apple Computers is there. IBM is there. And now any kid can get online and look up, like, say, I've had feelings of same-sex attraction. Is this, instead of hating myself, find a community online that, will help you understand and accept who you are, and who you are is completely normal and completely okay. And that just didn't exist at the time.
It seems quite isolated back then. And if you were, if you didn't feel like you fit in, it must have been frightening because you didn't know where to turn.
Yeah. One of my friends down the road who I spent a lot of time with as a kid is a gay man. He's a boy at the time. And a lot of like the scene in the very beginning with Naomi and Watson the Perseids comes from a real life experience, because me and my friend are watching the Perseid meteors. And I asked my mom for a second blanket. It's because we're laying out and it was a little chilly. And she's like, oh, well, are you guys going to make out and kiss and like being kind of mean about it? And I think in a joking way. And mind you, my mom has changed a lot over the years and she's progressed in her thinking. So it doesn't reflect who she is today. But that stuck with me. And was like, well, this is bad and you shouldn't do that and be afraid of being different. As soon as he turned 18, he went to university, Duke University, by the way, full scholarship, brilliant kid, which is like a really great university in North Carolina, and in the U.S. is one of the top, like maybe second or third best university in the U.S. And then he moved to New York City as soon as he graduated. I saw him in New York just a few days ago while I was there, because he had to get out, because there's no way he could live an authentic life in this region. He wasn't afforded the convenience that someone like I am afforded, because, well, like life has been easy for someone like me, other than being autistic. As long as I'm a little peculiar, but it's easy to hide as long as, I'm a tall, fit white man who's straight. I just keep my mouth shut and life's easy for me, So, but that never left my mind. Which led me to so North Carolina in 2006, I was one of the first, what we have called like Gay Straight Alliance coordinators or faculty sponsors is what it is. Technically, it's a faculty sponsor because I'm not allowed to coordinate for a high school in North Carolina. And, a lot of that stemmed, and a lot of my writing stemmed from that one experience, and just feeling that level of unacceptance just for a moment, knowing that this person is my friend, and that if I had that kind of interest in him, the same as I might a girl, then I would be completely cast aside, right? And then I realized, well, that's how he lives every single damn day. And, this went into my thinking from the time I was 17, 18 and kind of reflecting on it. So when I came out of school, I became a teacher. I had kids approach me about doing the GSA, what they call a QSA now, Queer Straight Alliance, which is after school program. In fact, I knew that one of the vice principals was a gay woman, but she couldn't do it because there's this whole, like, they're recruiting and now they call it grooming, which is bullshit. And that's not really what grooming is. And I'm a psych major. I won't go into I really hate when they take terms and use them for something they're not supposed to be because it dilutes the term. But I'm like this, straight white dude. I'm like, so like, you can't say I'm recruiting people. Someone's got to step up and do it, right? So I did. And I can assure you that it was highly uncomfortable being on the hot seat, and they came after my job and they protested, and they couldn't do anything about it because I had tenure. And it turns out there was already a Supreme Court ruling that said that as long as I wasn't the one that initiated it, and it was student led, then it was okay. That level of discomfort is nothing compared to the level of discomfort my friend felt for 22 years, so, that I did. And that program's still going on. And I think that one experience, probably that one thing my mother said, had more impact on me than I think that she thought. And I think parents say things sometimes flippantly and don't realize how much it affects their kid and what will stick with them. But it influenced me to, I think, do the right thing.
Did it also influence you in writing the short story Tar River Boys?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And so most of and I know, like I said, I'm a straight man, but most of my fiction, not my first book, which has no sexuality in it whatsoever, is queer fiction. And it's mostly because, well, it's the civil rights movement of my time. It's a reflection of the time I live in. And I've had people say, okay, well, I've had women and gay women say, well, how do you write, like, you're a straight man, you write a convincing woman, you write convince, and it seems convincing. And I'm like, well, I just put myself in someone else's shoes. That's really all you have to do. Okay. So what if that were happening to me? What if that, because what I have more in common isn't the sexuality, it is the humanity, and how, so we have humanity in common far, which is far greater in common than any of those small immutable things like sexuality or color of our skin. So that was the genesis of how I kind of proceeded to do that, because it continues to give voice to people. And I give voice to autistic people in this too, since I'm autistic. And it gives voice to people who are not just queer, but I think straight too, because, it says that no matter who you are, if you reject the things you were taught as a kid or someone hurt you, here's how you can, like, you're not alone. There are other people who are like you. There are other people who are hurt, even if they don't share that immutable trait with you. But one thing about being autistic, the queer community is one of the few places, the punk rock community, which was heavily interrelaced into the queer community in the 90s and the early 2000s, one of the few places they accepted kind of a weird, quirky, autistic kid. And the queer community, I found that the thing that really united me is that I spent a lot of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't, to make other people comfortable. So as an autistic person, I can't stem. I can't move my hands like this. I have to try to talk with more, not so flat, what they call flat affect, because it makes other people uncomfortable. I can't talk about Star Wars too much because it makes, that's just a silly example, but you know what I mean? Like, I have to be this, rigid, okay, I can't be myself because it's not acceptable. So, yeah. And yes, Tar River Boys was extremely influenced by that experience that I had. And, and that friendship really just, I've started talking to him again just a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I happened to have gone to New York, and I actually saw him here in town, because his dad passed
Mm-hmm.
a few weeks ago. So I met up with him, but then I had the New York thing. And so, yeah, the New York thing, was I did a reading. We do
Mm-hmm.
this thing called Noir at the Bar.
Mm-hmm.
And I do it here, in a place called Hillsborough. And there's this writer named Eric Pruitt. He's a really great writer, and he writes mystery, Southern Gothic noir stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he owns a bar called Yonder Bar.
Mm-hmm.
And he has really fantastic, well-known writers come in and read. And he was kind enough to invite me. And so things went pretty well. And like, I just get along, we just get along,
Mm-hmm.
like the people that came, we've gotten along really well. And so I got lucky enough to get invited to go up to, New York,
Mm-hmm.
and I just came back from doing a reading. I feel like I bombed. I And that's kind of the thing, you're overcoming the fear. If you're an autistic person and getting up and standing up in front of people, that's a lot for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, but I do it because I want to share the art,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a way to do that, share the art. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's important. And I don't want to look back and think, well, I could have taken this chance and I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's allowed me to meet a lot of really great writers. One of them asked me to write that short story or a compilation he's doing for Southern writers. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure whether or not that is going to come together.
Mm-hmm.
He said it may not, and that I could use, maybe if I wanted to use the story for something else, I might. So Tar River Boys may very well become a novel.
Mm-hmm.
I have a friend who's another writer who I let read it, and he said, "You know what, man?" He's like, "You've put so much. There's so much I want to know about this story."
Yep.
And now I wrote it in like 2 weeks, and like, you really should just take this and make it a novel.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a very good chance that may be the novel that I hope to have released in 2026.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't run it past my publisher, and I
Mm-hmm.
don't know how they are going to feel about it because of the way that the genesis of why I wrote it, or maybe they might be exhausted with publishing my material, which would be fine because they've signed me up for 4 books.
Mm-hmm.
4 books, 4 years in a row is a lot from one writer, but my goal is to try to write 1 book a year until I keel over.
Yeah, but this short story has a lot of potential.
Yeah, and it's about a young man whose father is a criminal,
Mm-hmm.
and he's getting out of prison. And it's a very patriarchal system he's living under. And him and his brother, they run cocaine from the Pamlico, which is the sound outside in the inner banks of North Carolina,
Mm-hmm.
which connect to the ocean.
Yep.
And drugs come up that way from Florida from time to time. And what they do is that they ferry the cocaine in their fishing boat up the Tar River, which is basically what used to be a transportation system for textiles and things of that nature. And they live off of that kind of once a week to kind of keep them from having to have that day-to-day job. And they have to deal with their father getting out of prison while simultaneously one of the brothers secretly is in love with another man.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not only does that other man, is it that he's a man, it is the fact that he's a black man, and he's a white, the brother's a white man, and that he's not out.
Yeah.
And he doesn't hate himself for it. He accepts the fact that he's a gay man, but he knows that other people won't accept him. And he's in love with this man, but he has to hide it. And then at the same time, his father's coming out of prison after 30 years, for murder, for murdering a woman. And, then he has to deal with his father, who is a neo-Nazi, enforcer in prison, who has Aryan, Brotherhood connections on the outside. And as you can imagine, that they're not fond of the fact that, or wouldn't be fond of the fact that brother is gay.
Yeah,
And
and in love with a black man.
in love with a black man. Exactly. And it can be it can be difficult still if you're in that situation here. I mean, I know it can be for sure. And that's kind of the crux of that story. But this region doesn't get a lot of attention, and the river systems and everything, and the church and everything that kind of carves the reality here doesn't get out much. And that's what I'm trying to do. I want to bring the rest of the world kind of a unifying message, but somewhere obscure, somewhere I know, and something uniquely North Carolina, or very regional North Carolina. There are only a handful of writers from this region. Alan Gurganus is the one that most people think of. He's from Rocky Mount.
Would you say that this region you talk about and this society you write about in this short story, but also in the other books, they live in their own kind of bubble?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's a bubble that's created by dominance, like overwhelming dominance, but physically, spiritually, and mentally, over the population, often through race, separating people based on that, separating people based on their sexuality, keeping them apart instead of together, where they, like you stay in your own little place. And when we talk about the other side of the tracks in the United States, that's a very literal thing. I think in my town is split between tracks. On one side, it used to be, it's not so much anymore. One side is the black side of town, one side is the white side of town. I live on the black side of town, technically, but that's not something that's as much of a thing anymore. But it was far more at the time. And one of the really disturbing things is we have voting districts in the United States. So you have a congressional district, and they do something called gerrymandering, where they split it, and they'll make the voting district go along a highway, and this long, looks like a salamander almost. And they'll do it so that they'll isolate minority populations that have to live in the cheapest area possible because they've been economically suppressed forever. And so next to the highway, next to the airport, and they'll make those districts to isolate populations so that it decreases their voting power. Well, my town was literally split between two congressional districts because the majority black side of town, they didn't want influencing the white election. But I have my running trail. I will actually go between two districts, and I wouldn't be able to reach it actually arcs around, and I wouldn't actually be able to run into the district that I came from. I would actually be able to run into it again if I kept running another 50 miles or 70 miles, and then I would come to it again. That's how insane the separation is, and it's like written into law. So yeah, it's all about parsing us off into little areas.
It's mind-boggling. But my question would also be, now that you said all that about this bubble is alongside of race relations or the divide between the black and the white. My question would also be the white supremacists like the Aryan Nation and others, the one you mentioned also in your books, they have a lot of grievances about feeling left out, feeling of left behind, and or also didn't get ahead in the world and so on. And what about the fact that Asian minorities in the United States do better than the whites? Do you think there might be another problem lurking?
Well, the thing about that is I really can't speak to that because my region in the South, the population of Asian Americans is actually very low. So that is not something I can speak to on a personal level. I don't have experience with that. A lot of the grievance has to do with economic grievance. And there for a long, long time, you could do a manual labor job and make a really good salary. And it's a damn shame you can't still do that. But there was this expectation. Well, my dad, my granddad, my great granddad worked in this factory, were able to make enough money to buy a house, have a couple of cars, have a couple of kids, and their wife doesn't have to work. That all disappeared for a number of reasons that I really, I'm not going to go into, but it's gone now. And they look at people who aren't tied to that problem and, because they do a different type of job and they have this anger toward them and feel like they have been left behind. But in the same way that they have stayed behind in a lot of ways, they've stayed behind also in their prejudice. And there's always a reason. There's always a locus of control. It isn't them. It is the other that has done this to them. It's never, I should take some level of responsibility and acquire a new skill. There's also this grievance that, this person has got my job, because they're willing to take less money and things of that nature. Because that's been the immigration issue, the entire existence of the United States, which is, these immigrants, these Irish immigrants, they took my job. These people are taking my job. It's always somebody doing something to me. It's not a question of what can I do to better my situation. I'm owed this because I'm a white man. I don't have to compete. I shouldn't have to compete. This is what I should be given. Now that's not the entire population. I don't want to, paint everyone that way, but that is a overwhelming feeling for many people. And that's reiterated in some popular media, like Tucker Carlson, who just got fired from Fox News, will talk about demographic change and how the country is being made dirtier. I mean, those are his words, and it's fueled by that. And it's fueled by that for political reasons, because it gives other people with financial interest in keeping the country separated. The grievances they have mean nothing to them, but keeping them thinking about the other and keeping them separated benefits them financially. So they continue to perpetuate it until it doesn't. Like when Dominion won $787.5 million from Fox News, and the next day Tucker Carlson's kicked off Fox News. It just shows you that was about the money, not about the grievance he was airing.
It somehow seems to me that these people somehow live in fear of maybe financial loss or religious, and their answer is to spread fear amongst others.
Yes, the answer is to spread fear, because fear means what manufacturing consent. Who is it that said that? I can see his face now, and I cannot think of his name. He's a writer, and damn it, I can't think of his name. Anyway, I'll think of it later. He's a linguist, but manufacturing consent is done through saying, here's something to be afraid of. I can protect you from it. If I can protect you, I can protect you from it if you just release the reins and let me do whatever I want, just like increasing taxes on the middle class while decreasing taxes on the wealthy in this country, and saying you're doing the opposite. Or, and then giving them some red meat, like abortion laws being turned back, which is in a lot of ways backfired on them, or restricting the right of people to have drag shows, even if they're just for adults. Tennessee, you can't have a drag show anymore, even if it's 18 plus. Which drag queens reading stories to kids, to me, it doesn't seem to be a problem at all, but you can get arrested for that now in Tennessee and several other states. So they have thrown them some reward because they have to, because it continues to feed the elections and the culture.
It's a way of getting people to not look where they should look.
Yeah, to distract them.
Yeah, it's like that. Obviously. Yeah. Robert, may
Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, that's the name.
Okay. I was thinking about him, but I wasn't sure. May I also ask you about I mean, okay, it's anticlimactic now, but since we ask all our guests, of course, this question, and you've touched a little bit already about the plans to question, actually. I mean, writing these books of yours and going on for book number 3 and book number 4, what would be your advice for other authors?
Advice for other authors is don't listen to the haters, even the ones in your head.
Okay. And the plans, you said book 3 and book 4, and maybe turning the short story into a novel?
Yes, I'm in the middle of writing book 3, which is called Prophet's Death, and it's the end of the trilogy. And I have written about 50 pages of Diary of Attrition, which is Tiffany's story. Follows her, no mythology there, just maybe even might consider it literary fiction because it's a lot of internal dialogue, a lot of dealing with emotions and things of that nature. And I'm very much leaning into the idea of turning Tar River Boys into a novel, though it's not 100% yet, because the compilation, if that comes through, it's difficult to turn down because the person doing the compilation is a very well-known writer. So it would get some traction, which gets your books looked at. And being a writer, you languish for a long time and sometimes permanently in some level of obscurity. And I think about it like an aperture in a camera and how it can open and shut in this circular metal. And there's sometimes like a pinpoint of light, like my aperture is just open, just a pinpoint in the last year, 2 years. And I can see a little bit of that light. And I just want to keep on pressing. And if turning it into allowing it to be on that in that other book as a short story means that aperture opens a little more because I have other books to write and I have other ideas to put forth, then I'm apt to allow that to happen. But if that's not the case, then I really would like to flesh that story out. It's worthwhile to flesh out, and the drug running part and the adventure part really appeals to my younger self, my 13 and 14-year-old self running through the woods.
And I have to say, I couldn't put down the other 2 books. I really couldn't. So please, no more trips to New York. Keep on writing.
Oh, well, my trip to New York was a trip. I was there I was reading in the West Village. Yeah. And like I said, I feel like bombing. The next thing I'm doing is I'm going to be at Creatures, Crimes, and Creativity Con in Baltimore in September. So I got invited to do that by another writer who was there. And so it's going to be a good time. It's just basically a bunch of us nerding out and
good for you.
Talking about literature and staying in a hotel and probably drinking too much. Which is what writers do.
Yeah, that's what they should do. I mean, we heard that because we usually go to Crime Fest in Bristol, and last year they emptied the bar.
They had to catch up after the pandemic.
So
my literature is often done under the influence of substances.
Well, so why not?
Whatever helps.
Yes, as long as you don't drive.
Oh, absolutely not.
Writing's allowed.
I mean,
writing is harmless drunk.
Exactly. Robert, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
Well, Prophet's Lamentation will be out on July 4th. So it can be purchased anywhere books can be purchased, including all ebook formats. And Prophet's Death is out now, but you can read Prophet's Lamentation as a standalone. I've written it so if you cannot deal with that darkness, it tells you what happened. And if you really enjoy it, I kind of look at it like a prequel. It's an origin story. You can read this story like the original Star Wars episode 4, 5, and 6. It's kind of like that. And then how George Lucas made 1, 2, and 3. You don't need to see 1, 2, and 3 to know that there were Clone Wars and things like that. But you can always go back and watch them if you want to.
Yep, absolutely.
See the darkness, see the origin.
And as someone who had the honor and the pleasure to read both books, dear listeners, read them. You will not regret it. It's absolutely worth reading them. You will not be able to put them down, because I wasn't.
I really appreciate that. You don't know how much it means to have someone appreciate your art.
Yep, it's the truth.
It means a lot.
It's the truth. Yeah, because I was up a very long time on Monday, I have to tell you, because I thought, nope, I'm not stopping. I want to know how this ends. I'm not turning off the light.
I appreciate that. I really do. Quite honestly, bottom of my heart.
It's the absolute truth. So, Robert, thank you so much for taking time for us. Thank you.
Thank you for taking time to talk to me and for enjoying my art.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
I hope to make something else you enjoy in the future.
Oh, I'm quite certain. You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.